Good evening, everybody. We are starting our episode a little bit different tonight because we have a very special topic at hand, and we want to be able to have enough time to dive in deeply with the subject matter. And before we actually get to our regularly scheduled episode for this evening. So, hello, I'm Nika Smith here, host of BlackProGen Live. I've got our panelists. The first being, or the ones that I see first, is Ellen Fernandez Sacco checking in from Tampa. We've got Shelly Murphy checking in from Virginia. We've got Teresa Vega checking in from Boogie Down Bronx. And then we've got True Lewis checking in from Fort Knox, Kentucky. And like I mentioned before, we want to have as much time to talk about this topic as we can before we have to leave this transmission of the show and then go into the regularly scheduled episode, which is episode 70, Slavery in the Ivy League. So if you're watching this first, great. Then be sure to head over to the episode that'll be happening later on tonight. So let me go ahead and just get into the subject matter. Senator Elizabeth Warren has been in the news quite a bit lately as a result of a video that she put up talking about her ancestry. And of course, if you've been following politics at any time in the last year, 2 years or so, you've seen how the president, I'll refer to as 45, I actually almost said that, how he's been referring to her in terms of her, her lineage, as she states that she has connections to Native American groups. There's a lot of discussion over whether or not that was used to an advantage for her with regard to her being hired for certain positions or being in certain jobs. I'm not here to get into all those semantics. We're here to talk about the genealogical implications of her lineage. And because of how the president responded to that, calling her the name Pocahontas, using it actually in the frame of like a racial slur. And then her response to that, which was to take a DNA test, have an expert in our industry in genetic genealogy and genetics to verify her claims. And then she put together this ad with her family members, bipartisan, and, put this commercial together or whatever it is, video together. And then the resulting onslaught of things that have taken place in the genealogical community as a result. And so if you haven't seen the spot, you might still be able to find it online. I know when I went to her channels, I did not see it anymore. And I think it was deliberately removed as a result of just all the controversy. So maybe we can find the link and put it in the chat so people can see it. But I imagine the majority of folks have seen it or heard about it. I highly encourage you to watch the video yourself. Don't watch a synopsis. Watch it yourself. So then that way you can decide what you want. It's the same thing as voting. You may not vote the same way on every measure, but if you actually read the law, there may be some things that stand out to you that, make you vote one way or the other. So the first question that I have for the panelists who are here tonight, you guys can feel free to come off mute, is what was your opinion upon hearing the news about Senator Warren in this DNA test?
Oh, goodness. I'll say it. I didn't have a problem with, and I don't have a problem with Elizabeth Warren or anyone else claiming their ancestors. She comes from a family that had a family history, as we all do, oral history, and she was claiming her ancestors. And that's one thing I think that people failed to mention. You didn't mention, but the whole Harvard situation is what Harvard did. She didn't claim to be a member of a sovereign nation or anything like that. She was claiming her ancestors, which is what we all tend to do. My issue, of course, again, has to do with her timing. However, she played into the hands of 45. And again, what you saw was real issues being looked over, and it was totally predictable. So here we are at a critical point in history, retro period, and yet there's issues, Native American issues not addressed, voter suppression among people of color. Let's talk about another hurricane, and yes, Puerto Ricans were the canaries in the coal mine. And again, the focus became on her, and it distracted from a lot of things. So, but I don't blame her for claiming any ancestors. I claim all of mine.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah,
Briefly?
I'm a little disappointed that she did it, number one, because she played right into his hands. And because he throws that stuff out, he, as in 45, throws that out chaotically. And actually, if you re-listen to him saying about the $1 million, he actually didn't just say that. Go back and listen to the tape. You know, he said, if so and so, I'd give $1 million. But she played right into him. I think she lost some folks because of her stepping out and doing that test, because she played right into him. She definitely lost me. So that's all I had.
Ellen and True.
And I think the timing was off for sure. I don't have a problem. Just I agree with Teresa and Shelley. You know, it was just the timing of it, and then in the response to someone who doesn't play by the rules to begin with. I mean, it just becomes a completely volatile and unpredictable situation, and it just sucks the air out of the room when you have really critical issues for people who are living on reservations, people who are living around the country in all kinds of situations. We're back to just talking about stereotypes, and that's really like a waste of time.
True.
I feel the same way as most of the majority of the panelists. It just goes back to me too. It just felt personal, and that people are going to be choosing sides, and it's division, and that she just fell into that trap. And she knew that was a bait. And yeah, it just, the timing and me just taking it a little bit personal about who's better than who.
Yeah, I think going back to the larger discussion, especially some of the things that we definitely want to hit on with regard to this conversation, because we're looking at it from, of course, we can't help but look at the social aspects of this and the political aspects of this. You know, you can't look at genealogy and family history and not think about those things. If you're not considering them as you're doing your research, then you may want to take a step back and think about why you're not considering those things. They affect all of the stuff that we look at, especially with regard to people of color genealogy research. Like, that's just the case. Like, why is there an N for Negro on censuses? Why is there an MU for mulatto? That is social. That is political, right? So for us to not make it about that is to sort of miss our calling or like miss our role in this. So the next question I have is, who gets to determine identity? Because to me, in this conversation, there's a larger implication of who gets to determine somebody's identity. And especially when it comes to people of color. Has our identity been determined, you know, by outside sources, not us?
Yes.
Yes.
No, it's
Historically speaking, exactly. Historically speaking, it has always been a state nation to determine who ethnicity and what ethnicity is. We know as genealogists that there is no such thing as race. It's a social construct that the state has codified. And looping back, since Shelley mentioned colored, in my whole, my family's been dealing with this 4 years. Me, the past 2.5 years, where you have a colored category in our cemetery fight, which was state defined. And it was a way to rip and steal land that was indigenous for the millennia. So if you want to erase people, you do that a number of ways. And you can do that by putting them in a category where years from now, 2018, I'm being told there were no Native Americans in the late 1700s. And I'm like, hello, we're still here. So these entities have always been politicized. And I'll throw it in, just 2-3 days ago, you now can add gender to the categories that are being erased.
Ellen?
For me, this is all like one big rerun. There's a lot of dragging up of a lot of really older ideology and older techniques by this government to control people of color. The thing that people have to remember, though, about these categories is that they change. And the reason they change is from the bottom up. It's the pressure that people put on the government that gets these definitions changed. You know, it's thousands of people in the street. It's thousands of people voting. It's thousands of people. And change is glacial. The progress of the change is slow. But there have been changes made. So we have this collision course between this kind of like eugenic categories that the government has been invested in a long time. And then you have that issue of self-determination. And it's like this collision that's constantly getting worked out since the beginning of the country.
Shelley?
Yeah. I grew up colored, Negro, gotta do black, you know, Afro, African American, you know, and I've never determined that myself. Someone else has determined that for me and other people, you know, that have African American, you know, heritage or whatever you want to call it. But I will have to give a little bit to 45. And I think of the stuff in Charlottesville and the stuff that happened and things going around in the country. He's bringing those folks out of the closet. They are your neighbors. They're in your family. They're everywhere. That are the ones that are trying to determine that you are less than them, you know, type things. So that's one thing I'd have to give him kudos. He's bringing it all out and bringing it out right straight, you know, right to the table. And there's no holding back. So
True.
Until we are able to do something.
I agree. True.
Yeah. So how did you ask that again? Ask that to me again.
She's like, I need the question again. But the conversation I want to have is who gets to determine identity. And Shelley hit it on the head, is that when you arrive in this world, you are already labeled.
Yeah.
As a person of color, you are already labeled. When I had my son, just as I always joke that when I was a kid, I remember having to go to the Social Security office and go and get my Social Security number. And when my son was born, it was like he was born and it literally came out of a machine, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing as him being labeled as African American, you know, which doesn't accurately reflect every part of his lineage.
Right.
But, you know, has our identity, us being able to determine our identity, been co-opted away from us? And the large conversation, the conversation we're having is that, yes, it has been, because we were labeled by somebody else when we got here. And you're wondering, what does this have to do with Elizabeth Warren? It has everything to do with her.
Everything.
Everything. Her identity was who she said she was, right? But because it involved people of color, naturally, we want to take back what's ours that we have control over, because everyone else has placed labels on us and told us who we were. And that's been, you know, Ellen, you've done a lot of important work on eugenics and how that shaped policy and laws and decisions and things that are still being enacted in this country right now. So for us to look at this situation with her and not recognize that, yes, she has lived her life, you know, as a white woman visibly, right? Because your appearance, your visible appearance can garner you much more if people perceive you as one thing versus something else, right? There are benefits, and unfortunately, there are benefits that some people who are lighter skinned or have straighter hair get than folks who are darker skinned who have curlier hair. Right. So for her, in essence, to claim an identity of somebody who's been marginalized, right? People took issue with that. But I have to always raise this point. That's what she was told.
Yes.
Who are we as researchers to sit here and debate what she was told and how she was raised?
Definitely. I always say there was a story that went in our family about the family donated land, I find a document where they sold the land. There was no way I was going to my mother and her siblings, and tell them something different that they have known for the last 80 years because they were told that the family donated that land and they didn't. They sold it for $35. And I say, no way, I'm going up all 80-year-olds and going to tell them that their mama lied, you know, or somebody lied to her.
Somebody lied to her. But here's the other thing. How are we? So not only as a community, because I've seen this conversation taking place in on people's walls, with statuses in Facebook groups, on Twitter, in our genealogical community. How are we as a group going to judge her for the identity that she has crafted or that her family has crafted? How can we judge her when so many people in our own community literally utter the words that she utters at every conference we go to?
Exactly.
You can look at so many Facebook groups, and I can't even tell you I just saw one the other day where the girl, so this person had native blood, and I'm trying to trace. How is that person any different than Elizabeth Warren?
They're not. They're not. Not at all.
And that's my thing. Why are we making a difference between her and other people? Are you scrutinizing the folks in our own community who were still chasing down this Indian princess myth in their own families? Right. Have we chased them down? But is it because she's up there in a position where we can't really touch her that it makes it safe for us to start throwing jabs at her that aren't going to land? To me,
and you
her identity is her identity.
It's hers.
To me, it's the same as Rachel Dolezal believing she's Black. Yes, I said it.
Yes, you
because
did.
That's her.
That's her reality.
It. Yeah,
but
the test results are different.
Exactly, their test results are different. You're right, but that is how she identifies. And who am I? Who is thinking to come up in here and be like, "Girl, no." Now, I think it's crazy. A lot of people think it's crazy. They think she's got delusions of grandeur. I didn't watch her Netflix special or show. I wasn't going to do that to myself. But that's how she lives. But think about it from that perspective. So the next question I have, because I just had to get that out, because Lord Jesus, that was driving me crazy. We got to talk about blood quantums, because that's another thing that really drove me up the wall about these conversations that I was seeing amongst our community is, well, she's only 1/1000th. We have to talk about how those blood quantums themselves were instituted by the federal government. Nobody was walking around talking about she's a quarter blood. Who the heck does that?
White America. Yes, they do that.
And the other thing is, you have to recognize when blood quantums came into existence. Okay, again, I have Native American mtDNA on my African side. We have the oral history. We have the genealogy record. We have everything. And yet there are some today who would say that's not enough for me to claim. Even though with DNA, I have cousin matches to people who are known second and third cousin members of, let's say, the Lenape Nation. Well, so what happens to someone like my family when we can go back to the 1600s and yet you've instituted these blood quantum policies late 1800s, early 1900s that effectively erase people who came before? And again, let us remember your first slaves in this country were Native American, and let us talk about survival techniques for genocide. We weren't like them. We accepted everybody. And my history, family history, it is known Native women and men of African descent.
That's not the story for all. That's the story
right. Not the story for everybody. Right.
That's not the story for everybody, because and there's something that was raised in the group. Carmen, of course, she says that there was a woman that she follows on Twitter that says that they have a right to decide who's part of the community. Absolutely, they do. Anybody can decide that. But here's where the rubber meets the road on this, because we're not talking about the nation that Teresa brought up. We're talking about the one that I have ties to and that I know the history of. And they don't recognize everybody that they were supposed to technically recognize as being part of their community. So because I was rejected because I'm a freedman, does that mean because they don't claim me that I can't apply for membership, that I don't have blood, just like Teresa said, or share DNA with people who are on the bi blood roll. That, I mean, come on now. It's all of this is subjective based off of federally mandated statutes. That's what I want people to get about this.
Right.
This is not, I'm telling you, people were just Cherokee. They were just Chickasaw. They were just whatever. And then when the federal government came in and had to issue those land allotments, that was how they weeded people out. That is why freedmen have their own segregated role with no mention of their Indian blood on there. We don't even
By
have blood
design.
quantums on our cards because it's by design.
Because it's
By
from the
design.
1924 Racial Integrity Law by Walter Plecker. I mean, he
Yes,
said there's
talk more
only
about
white
that,
people
please.
and there's only colored people. And then if you're
that's
colored,
it.
you can only be colored or Negro, and that's it. And you couldn't be married. And this thing couldn't be gotten rid of until Loving versus Virginia. So I mean, that's a
about 40
long years, long time for people to deal with the erosion of their identity and to be crammed into these categories. One of the really insidious thing was that his assistant, Emily Kelly, she would take a sheet that would say this birth has been entered incorrectly and staple this sheet to it, and then change the identity of the person on the sheet from Indian to colored. And they would retroactively do this. And it took ages for people who are now, tribal groups now who have federal recognition to achieve that. Because the first thing the government asks you for is your birth certificate. And what does that say? You know?
Clarify, that was in Virginia.
Right. But it was across the country.
Vital statistics.
Well, that was that vital statistic. There was a need for birth certificates, you know, but the way they figured this out wasn't even just Plecker doing this in 24. You have to go back to like 1910 with the opening of the eugenics record office in Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island. And when you read these, and I recommend people read these brochures. They have them on the Oregon Digital Library. The state of Oregon has a Eugenics in Oregon site that actually reproduces the whole thing, And you have to see how obsessed these people were. It's a race panic from 1910 that these people had, that somehow, and you read these ridiculous headlines, you know, oh, the American race is at an end, you know, there's more people of color and people are freaking out about it. So then they design all of these laws to get people at the time of their birth to reclassify them and to constrain them legally. It's really, I had no idea it was that developed at 1910. So then you have 60,000 people sterilized as a result of these laws too.
Right.
You know?
60 people, he's not, and here's the thing. We have to remind people that these were not just people of color who were sterilized.
No.
These were less desirable, or what they called
feeble.
What do they call it? Feeble-minded. Not only that, but defective ancestry.
Right.
That's how they refer to these people. If you had defective ancestry, they would take a tally of how many murderers, how many criminals, how many drunkards in your family line. These are all things that we literally, the training, and this is another larger point that we have to talk about in our community. We need to rectify the fact that genealogy was started as a result of eugenics.
That's right.
The origins of it go back to what we're talking about you not being able to claim your own identity, for somebody else to come and label you. That's the whole process of eugenics. That's the basis of where genealogy comes from, because people were trying to justify that they were not defective, that their ancestry, that their stock was not defective. It's the same reason why in our community, people are so hung up on sharing their lineages and who they trace back to, is because people hang their hat on this stuff. But they don't realize that the seeds of this go back to the very controversial and ridiculous topic of eugenics.
Yeah.
And the very fact that we have this show, that people of color, we weren't even supposed to know about genealogy. It was not built for us. So this literally flips it on its head, because now we're educating ourselves about our family histories. We're not being told that we're defective because of somebody else's research.
And I would add, Nika, is getting back to what Ellen and Shelley had previously said. these categories only work one way. For example,
Yeah.
when I was born, 1967, yeah, I'm half a, over 50. My birth certificate said I was white. There was no Latino classification. Now, can I go around saying I'm white? Would people perceive me as white? I mean, in college, I used to pull out my original birth certificate and say, I'm white like you.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you to tell me that I'm not? This is what the government told me. Now, of course, I applied for a passport, the new birth certificate got rid of race, but I still have the original one. And so, Mika, talk about one drop, how that worked.
That's what I was going to say. 12 years later, there was not a brace on my birth certificate at all. It doesn't exist on there. And my son's doesn't have one
Really?
either. No. So, and here's the thing. My best friend was born
kids,
in
they're still
California. My best friend was born in California, same state as me. 3 years earlier, hers had a race and it said Negro on it. So at some point within that time period, that changed. So let's talk about, because we only have a few minutes left. We all know, and we should know, that DNA does not equal culture. But how can we? But we also don't want to discourage people from exploring their newfound ancestry, right? So this may be something that might be new to you. I have a cousin. I've told this story multiple times. More than a quarter of her DNA shows up as Native American, because she's got a Native American ancestor, or her ancestor's actually Mexican. And so how would someone like her, who's got this newfound ancestry, how would they go about exploring their newfound ancestry without appropriating culture quickly?
DNA cousin matches. You can't, admixture alone isn't an indicator. So my first line of defense is go and triangulate your matches, reach out to them. And, that is the proof right there. Okay. No one should be looking at admixture in it of itself. You have to do the triangulation of your matches. From there, I would say, go to local history, find out more about, you can't just use admixture in and of itself. And we need to keep telling people that over and over again. Anyone
we've got to talk about, though, admixture, meaning the percentages, the pie chart that you're getting. Right. You can't go on that. There's more power in the DNA matching. Shelly, quickly, because I
just said genealogy. Don't leave out genealogy and tracking back. I agree with Teresa saying the triangulation. Absolutely. But don't do anything with DNA unless you got some genealogy and some other things to back it up.
Your paper trail.
Ellen, where would you like to?
Don't worry about it. I said, learn what settler colonialism is. Learn what that process is. Why appropriate people's lands? I mean, what was some of the reasoning for categorizing some people? I mean, look at your local history. But I mean, one of the things also that a lot of people aren't aware of is his history, the variety and the richness of Native American history in this country. I mean, there's so many stories, so many areas, but to be able to then kind of chunk that down into your local area, but to really understand that whole process of movement in clearing out that happened during the 18th and 19th centuries,
I want to chime in. Angela is going off in the chat room, so I want to give her a voice.
Let me go look.
She's going off, but I'll read it. She said, in the 1940s, letters to and from Washington have been shared recently about the need to use the freedman role that intentionally omitted the blood ties that their former slaves had to their nation. Yet the Cherokee Nation, or Choctaw, or Chickasaw, or Seminole, or Creek will admit people who are 1/5000th degree of native blood. This is the nation that we're talking about when reference to Senator Warren. Okay. Part of the 5 civilized tribes. Angela goes on to say, and the policy is now to use a 104-year-old record, which is the Dawes roll, that omitted the Indian parent of former slaves. Yes, it did. To deny the great-grandchildren who were anywhere from 6 to 15% native. Absolutely correct, because that's what happens with me. And in the genealogy community, people never even mention the freedmen on the records they use. No one ever mentions us. Yet there are over 14,000 former slaves among these tribes. So just think about how they pivoted against her and said, you're not one of us. But then technically my paperwork is sitting there with the nation because I can become a member, because legally we had to sue to get it. And yet here it is. We talked about DNA matching. Me and my family match upwards of 50 people whose ancestors are on the by blood roll. So this statement by the Cherokee Nation, I'm just going to read it because it was from the Secretary of State. He said a DNA test is useless to determine tribal citizenship. That is absolutely correct because they, depending on the nation, they set their own standards. With the Cherokee Nation, you have to have an ancestor who was on the Dawes roll. As Angela mentioned, that roll is very flawed, but that's the standard that they use to determine membership within the nation. He also goes on to say current DNA tests do not even distinguish whether a person's ancestors were indigenous to North or South America. Sovereign tribal nations set their own legal requirements for citizenships. And while DNA tests can be used to determine lineage, such as paternity to an individual, it is not evidence for tribal affiliation. Using a DNA test to lay claim to any connection to the Cherokee Nation or any tribal nation, even vaguely, is inappropriate and wrong. And that statement is absolutely 110% wrong. Yeah. And I'll clarify in a second. It makes a mockery out of DNA tests and its legitimate uses, while also dishonoring legitimate tribal governments and their citizens whose ancestors are well documented and whose heritage is proven. Senator Warren is undermining tribal interests with her continued claims of tribal heritage. And this is why that statement that I just mentioned to you was wrong. Autosomal DNA testing can unearth ancestral ties to any group of people. Strike out the fact that it's native.
Right.
You can unearth ties to any group of people, human people, let alone Native Americans, just as Teresa pointed out briefly earlier before. But you have to use the DNA matching along with traditional genealogy.
But what is that actually telling you, what, Nika? What is that, all of that, what you just said?
What it tells me is, and I'm going to speak as a Cherokee, right?
Okay.
X the word freedom. I'm going to speak as a Cherokee, where my great-grandparents on my grandmother's side, their families lived there for generations. This is not somebody just ran in and decided to get on the Dawes roll, right?
Right.
Me and my family have upwards of 40 DNA matches that are descendants of a chief. 40. And this is using DNA matching. This is not based off of my little 5% Native American DNA. But when I apply to the nation, I have to apply as a freedman. To hear the Secretary of State say that the fact that I share DNA, which definitely means that I have an ancestral tie in the nation to this specific person, to hear him dismiss that is very dangerous and it's erroneous. And it also supports the system of I get to label you.
Right.
That's how
where did
I
they get
hear
that from?
They got it. It's the established structure that we already talked about. It comes from blood quantums.
It's how they shut people up.
Where did it come from? It came from white.
Well.
And so you're repeating things, and what I'm hearing is stuff I grew up about. That, you know what I'm saying? And everybody got labeled. It was a choice that they picked and choose who gets to come in their house.
Yes.
And you,
even though we were already there shining the stuff up.
Right. And you're not allowed to come in. And it's really based on skin color. It really has nothing to do with the blood.
Come on now. Every time, all my oral history about somebody appropriating a crime or performing an act against my ancestors' will has been verified based on DNA in the Cherokee Nation. Every single one of them has been verified. And I'm talking about first-person accounts in those documents that we talked about earlier. So I just really want to drive this home. Percentages alone do not, and shouldn't be the focus of the conversation. The DNA matching should be the focus. And if her team had known this, if the Cherokee Nation, when they made their statement, had known this, I don't think it would be that big of an issue if she came out in the ad with a cousin of hers that is on the by blood roll and said DNA showed us as a DNA match. How would that be any different than siblings finding each other if they were born to the same parents?
Right.
You
feel differently, Shelley?
There's no question there. You know why.
And I'll add, this is why our voices are important, and this is why we have to write our ancestors, their history back into the historical record.
That's why we got to tell the story.
This is why we have to tell the story.
I want to know how different that statement is from Charles Davenport in 1910 when he said, how high can we build a wall to keep out the cheaper races?
Exactly.
It's the same thing.
And we're repeating it right here in 2018. It's actually going on now.
And what rights do I have? What rights do I have to claim this or that? It's a big circle from that time. We watched that PBS series on American Experience, and rest in peace to Carrie Buck that was sterilized. And it was just like with Anne Frank. The United States is just as much guilty for killing her, because that her family tried to come in these gates when they closed off those walls and only let 3% in, and all the contacts he knew, he still couldn't get Anne and his family in. So we're just as culpable in her murder. You can't just say it was the camps there in Germany. USA did that too.
Absolutely.
And this is why I always say on Twitter, hashtag no Ellis Island here, because it's important that people realize, if you really want to do resist genealogy, let's not talk about 45 and his cronies. Let's talk about going way back. And then some of us have always been here for the millennia. Some of us came, my African ancestors came 1620. Okay, who are you to tell me this country isn't mine or my ancestors?
All that stuff is a fallacy. They just tried to put some stats over here and get a person.
It all goes back to the
and it was all fake.
I agree.
It was all fake.
Yeah. So just in closing, the point I really want to drive home is DNA does not equal culture. That the percentages part of the DNA testing is not where your focal point should be. It should be on the matching, because that's where you can establish relationships with your family that were unknown to you, and you can do the most work and get the most information for unearthing the names of those ancestors that you did not know. It's in the matching. It is not in the percentages. And to focus the conversation on that is to do a disservice to everybody involved. And, I think our community, we've already talked about this. We're going to do an entire show on eugenics next year, because I think genealogists need to be clear on the origins of of the industry that we're in. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are still trying to make this master race. But when you have folks online misinterpreting genetic studies that make them feel like they're superior and saying that race is actually hard-coded in our DNA and whatnot, having milk chug-a-thons to prove that they're not lactose intolerant. I mean,
it's scary
just
to
cockamamie
see.
stuff. But how different is that? Is that extreme from people arguing over her percentage of Native American DNA? And the institutions that we have and some of the practices that they still do within the genealogical community can be tied back to the origins of our industry. So we have got to go because we have another show that we need to start. So if you are in the chat room, be sure to head on over to that particular episode. We'll be seeing you in about 20 minutes. Good night.
Thank you, Nika.